MTN SME Hub. Link to growth. Link to success. Link to the ultimate resource for business advice and insights.
Welcome back to the Big Small Business Show. Today in studio we've got Jordan Toy. He's Director and Wealth Manager at Legacy Family Wealth. And we're talking about tariffs and the impact on our economy. And we've been talking about, the fact that obviously it's going to be much harder to export into the US. But there are other markets, as we've spoken about. But I've been around long enough to remember different export incentives over the years. There was GICE at one time. There were all these different export incentives that the government put in place in order to stimulate export. I know there are export incentives now, but has there been any talk in terms of changing those, improving those, stimulating those? Because for me, if our government right now, this is a great wake-up call to say how vulnerable we are to a single market, and now use that as impetus to create more specific incentives around the vulnerable industries, as you highlighted, those 3 vulnerable industries, and others. Is there a task force? Is there somebody thinking about this? Is something going on?
So we've seen sort of bits and pieces of that from governments. I think the disappointing aspect is that it almost seems to be not a proactive approach and more reactive. But be that as it may, we are where we are. And we've seen that in certain spaces, like citrus is a great example, right? So our citrus industry is an area where we arguably have a big competitive advantage, right? It's us and Spain and a few other places that are some of the biggest producers of really good citrus. And Spain, I think, largely wants to protect their home market in Europe.
Yeah.
So call it in the last year, I believe, maybe a little bit longer, they introduced additional barriers that our exporters had to go through to get their products into Europe. And we've definitely seen government sort of fighting on behalf of our citrus producers to try and deal with that, obviously alongside industry. So I think in certain pockets there are examples of government working to help our own industries. I mean, it also is in government's interest from a tax and revenue perspective, et cetera, that these businesses can thrive. So I think that there's always, we can always point out the examples where more could be done. Sometimes it's harder to look at, well, what are we already doing and what are we doing relatively well? I'm not saying that that's the case here, but I think that there's definitely that incentive on government side now because we are backed into a bit of a corner. So we've rapidly got to start looking at other options.
You know, I've just come back from a trip to Rwanda, and I see the cannabis industry starting to take hold in that country, and big support from government, big incentive for investors, international investors. I haven't been too close to the cannabis industry, but it seems like an obvious opportunity that South Africa has in terms of from an agricultural perspective. Have you seen an increase, or has it have you heard anything around that as a possible other big export opportunity for South Africa?
So I think there was a lot of excitement initially when we started seeing some of the legislation being changed, and I know of certain businesses that are in the process and exporting to all intents and purposes, high quality products overseas to sort of the likes of Canada and the US. So, but the impression that I've gotten is that there's a lot of red tape in that industry, and it's not very easy to get the required licenses in place to actually, it might be one thing producing locally, but to be able to export. And, when we're talking about those kind of products, I think these are largely high tech facilities that are being put in place. There's expensive machinery, factories that need to be set up. So there's a big capital investment, and which is obviously a barrier to entry, and then you've got quite a lot of red tape sort of making it more difficult for these businesses to get set up, and sort of the competitive economic forces to take over, and certain businesses will succeed and others won't. And I think broadly speaking, that's across the board, right? It's pretty well known that it's sometimes a bit more difficult than maybe it should be to set up industries, different businesses, and sort of get the private sector going. So yeah, I think in summary, we are doing well in that space, but not nearly as well as I argue that we could be.
And from your perspective, are there any other, let's call it, hidden industries that we've got an opportunity to exploit at the moment into other export markets? I saw in the White House interaction that I think President Ramaphosa mentioned three times. You need minerals. I think he mentioned it 3 times. Are there not opportunities in other markets for those minerals that, and I don't know what those minerals were. I know they were inferred to. But are there not opportunities around those rare earth metals, or I don't know what they were?
So definitely, the difficulty becomes, so we're largely just exporting, we're pulling it out the ground and sending it to China or the US. We're not actually refining or beneficiating, I think is the correct term to use, any of these minerals that we're pulling out of the ground. And we often hear about, no, we need to have the refining capacity here. But again, these are big facilities. Often we're talking in the metal space about smelters, which require lots of electricity, and there's costs associated with that. So the opportunities are there. And at the moment, we're just sending that offshore for somebody else to do that work. And I think that increasing drive and the potential that we have is significant, because part of transforming, I suppose, or advancing the economy is not just sort of the typical view around Africa being sort of the resource basket of the world, and that's kind of all that Africa has to offer. I mean, I really look at the banks a lot, and we have phenomenal online sort of banking systems across our big major banks. And I mean, I briefly went to the States, and you try and actually interact with some of their banks, and it's frightening how, I don't want to say archaic, but our banks deserve a bit more credit than often they get. And the fintech space is something we also know that we do well in, like the likes of a Vodacom, MTN, sort of mobile payment systems. I think the areas are there that we can lean into. Are we doing as much as we could to sort of lean into? It might not be a competitive advantage now, but the opportunity is certainly there. And that's an area, for the fintech space is one that I think that we, not as much capital is required to start a business in that space. It's more creativity and identifying problems and finding solutions.
Jordan, I'm glad you ended off on that point, because for me, I think that us entrepreneurs are often too focused on all the doom and gloom. And I know that the successful entrepreneurs, whenever there is a crisis like this, know intuitively and instinctually that there is also a massive, massive opportunity that arises when the sands are shifting, when the rocks are cracking. There's massive opportunity for entrepreneurs that are alert and aware of what those opportunities are. And if you are one of those entrepreneurs right now, I think if I were you, I would be thinking about and I am actually doing this. What can I be exporting now? Because I think that heightened view and that is in the economy right now, that we need other markets, is a wave that is going to start to build over time. And I would want to take advantage of that, and I hope you do too. And that's good for you, it's good for me, and it's good for the economy. Jordan, thanks so much for being on the Big Small Business Show, and thanks for watching. And as always, remember, if you think it, write it down and make it a reality.
The Big Small Business Show, proudly sponsored by MTN Business.